let me introduce Chris Patrick, who now works for Birmingham City Council. Effectively, in fact, succeeded Mike into his role in Birmingham. Previously, many of you will know Chris anyway, I suspect, not least for the important work he did previously in Coventry. But now, having moved to Birmingham, Chris is going to talk to us about recent archaeological discoveries and conservation projects in Birmingham. So hopefully you are there, Chris.
Oh yes, can you hear me?
Excellent. Right, I'll hand over to you whenever you're ready.
Right, hello. Yes, as an introduction, I'm Chris Patrick, and my job is the Principal Conservation Officer of Birmingham City Council. So, although I think I billed myself as archaeology and conservation projects today, I'm largely going to be talking about archaeology actually, because quite a lot has actually happened, and I'm also going to be pointing out that pretty much all I'm talking about are the efforts of other people. So hopefully I'll remember to credit them where appropriate. So starting off again is Perry Barr really, and I suppose having sat through Mike's sort of summary of the West Midlands, it's quite Perry Barr did actually come up quite a lot. I think for the sort of casual observer, you'd think sort of Perry Barr was sort of Pompeii in Birmingham, because there's quite a lot of interesting stuff going on here in what is initially looks quite an unpromising situation. And I think that applies for most of the things I'm going to quickly chat around today. So here we are. For those of you that don't know Perry Barr, there's obviously the Greyhound track there, but in the main the main feature, of course, is the River Tame that sort of crosses the site from sort of east to west and sort of loop around and leaving this sort of promontory. Now, big red arrow. There's quite a few big red arrows in this today. And there's sort of green, pointing at sort of green square there. Now, this was sort of an area we sort of extrapolated the line of Ricknell Street running across it. We think that the road would have gone north to south and then sort of crossed the river somewhere at the top. And much to the top there was where the site that Mike mentioned earlier, where they found the pollen sequences sort of stretching back to the Neolithic. And also, just near the arrow to the north, there's also, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this area here, area of allotment, has turned up quite a lot of Roman finds, and location of a postulated Roman fort. So, looking at that site there, green spaces don't often come up for development in Birmingham, so we took the opportunity to suggest doing a geophysical survey. And geophysical surveys in urban areas are usually very hit and miss because of just past disturbance and whatever else. And to be honest, I find they rarely seem to work. But on this rare occasion, it did actually seem to come up with something. So if you're looking at the sort of where the two arrows are pointing there, this is where we think the Roman road would have crossed the site. Just to see two sort of near features, sort of just running down there and there. Well, of course, the areas to the sides and to the bottom, you get the sort of usual noise you usually find with geophysical survey in urban areas, reflecting, pumping, and past use and general churn. So, Worcestershire Archaeology did some trial trenching and trenching across the road, and as you can see, they sort of intersected it, across there and across there. And the rest of the area around here was again proven just to be sort of full of asbestos and other sort of stuff, but I'll say a bit more about that as well in a moment. Again, we have these roadside ditches. No sign of the anything that we see Mike showed earlier in Sutton Park, and that sort of high degree of preservation and dagger and so forth. No dated finds. But what was quite interesting about it, oh sorry, this is going back to the industrial waste. Again, these areas to the side, as I said here, where you have all this disturbance, we get a lot of dumping material. It almost seems waste here from sort of button manufacturing and buckles. And we're assuming this large chunks of sort of central Birmingham may well have just been sort of scooped out sometime in the sort of mid 20th century and then redeposited in Perry Barr. So again, this is all redeposited material, but again shows really quite how confusing it can get. The main interesting thing that turned up here, as well as what we think of the ditches of the Roman road, are these Bronze Age pits. And as Mike said, we don't finding historic settlement in urban areas is a very sort of hit and miss thing. You've got to get quite lucky, really. You don't usually have the telltales that you may well get in a rural area, such as crop marks or physical surveys. So we have this little cluster of pits here, and what the lady there is excavating is we have a upturned urn from the early mid-Bronze Age, about 2000 BC. And it's the sort of thing that we've in the past it's been found out in Staffordshire, places like Whitemore Hay, in association with cremation burials, but no sign of cremation actually in the vessel. It does seem to have been sort of deliberately deposited. It just seems to have been very lightly worn. It doesn't seem to have actually been used that much. It seems to have been placed upside down and then with a broken quernstone placed upon it. And just to the sort of south of that, we get this sort of linear run of pits. And again, we're finding some Bronze Age pottery in them. And we also, in one of the pits also, we found what was the actual other half of the quernstone found in the first group of pits. So we're looking to see these things seem to be contemporary and almost indicating sort of a deliberate deposition. But as Mike has also said, you know, we've often had burnt mounds and so forth, but the actual sort of settlement evidence has largely been lacking. But it does show that it is there, and you know, if you extrapolated that across the whole of the Birmingham area, the West Midlands conurbation, there's probably a high degree of prehistoric settlement. And of course, I mean, another feature, of course, as well, just up the top up here, my cursor, was an Iron Age pit. So that was radiocarbon dated to about 400 BC. Again, you're seeing that contained smithing waste, slag, heat cracked stones, hammer scale, and again, so suggesting metalworking, and again suggesting that you know, settlement up on this little promontory at Perry Barr was going on for quite a long time. This is looking back across the site south, so we've got the ditches on either side, and we think this is Ricknield Street. And as was indicated to us, we've got ditches about 18 metres apart, non-continuous, and very similar to what we're seeing in Sutton Park, a couple of miles to the north. And so moving into Birmingham city centre and leaping forward quite a considerable amount of time, we're looking at the Birmingham Moat. Now, this was the sort of seat of the Birmingham family from about the 12th century, and now sort of sits sort of south of St Martin's Church, as it always did, and much where the wholesale markets sat in Birmingham city centre until they were recently demolished. So looking at medieval Birmingham, this is lifted from Davidovich's Dugdale paper on the Birmingham rentals. It's well worth a read. Again, gives you an idea of sort of Birmingham in the sort of 14th century here, with the manor house sitting at the foot of a triangular marketplace with St Martin's there, High Street there, and the Lord's Park parked over to the sort of north and east. So we're this is Birmingham again, 1750, and we still see that general layout survives. I mean, the lower part of the marketplace has obviously been filled in with housing and development, but the moat's still a visible feature, and it survived as a visible feature until 1816, when the land to the south was eventually freed up for development, and the moat and buildings were flattened, the moat was filled in, and the new market buildings were erected over it. So, most archaeologists in Birmingham, it's one of the more sort of well-known and sort of hallowed sites, and this is roughly where we sort of think it is, underneath the corner of the wholesale markets and Moat Lane, and what used to be the rag market would have been just up the sort of northeast there. And this was revealed in a watching brief that was carried out in 1975 by Lorna Watts, and it's very much a piece of rescue excavation. But lo and behold, beneath the Victorian market buildings, they did find these rather fine sort of walls and stone foundations suggesting a from a substantial 13th century building. That's looking forward towards the Moat car park. This is a view looking back the other way, looking towards where the Bullring Centre and the rag market would have been a few years, about 20 years ago. So obviously the markets are gone now, so things are moving forward, looking at what's going to happen in this area in the future. So the question really was to find out whether any of the moat and the walls did actually survive the rebuildings in the 1970s. So on the left there, we've got sort of a map and sort of foundations were intended to intersect our trenches. The time we actually map on the right shows what we actually ended up excavating, because the area was rather ridden with electricity cables and fibre optic cables and so forth. And trench by Cotswolds Archaeology, and found this rather sort of soggy mess here, which was the moat. The moat does actually seem to be slightly further over than we initially thought. But the main sort of feature of interest was we did find that the remains of the stone buildings, and you can just see here, give it an idea of the location in relation to Martin's and the Bullring Centre and Selfridges. And on the left there, the chap sort of just crouching down is working at where front of that chamfered stone wall, and then onto the right hand side, stepping back a bit further, we can see the moat fill that butts up against these stone walls. And again, it's sort of showing that it did survive, and we do seem to have quite a lot in place. And again, other objects coming out of this, mouldings potentially from a door jamb, covered from the moat, giving us a better idea of what the buildings would have looked like. Again, this is looking about sort of about 14th century. One notable thing really was that, of course, Lorna Watt was working in a watching brief, really looking at sort of people digging holes down pile bases. So it was very much an excavation that was done in sort of vertically rather than horizontally. But given the opportunity now to excavate in plan, the sort of section that she would have seen there obviously does expand. As we see going across the trench, we do actually seem to have the foundations and floor surfaces of the medieval building. So stepping away from the moat and moving across the road, there's a well lane in a site known as the Bamora Quarter, where there's a new tower block going to be erected there. And again, sort of stepping back into the map that George provided, this is the sort of area where we're looking at now. So we would have properties on the sort of north east side of the Bullring, and their backlots would run back to the ditch, what was known as the Herson ditch, and beyond that would have been the park, park of the Birmingham. And Park Street, which is one side, was a later insertion, and gradually what you're seeing is as the town expands, we're having Moore Street and Park Street get laid out, and we're gradually, as we're seeing in other places like Coventry, the park is something that's gradually sort of expanded into. And this is an excavation by Headland Archaeology. This is very, very quick. This has happened fairly recently. So what we see in front of us there is the infilled Herson ditch with the bucket sitting in it. And then beyond that would have been the land, would have been formed, would have been within the park. I would be standing now within the medieval plots. Beyond that would have been the park. And again, judging from how high the medieval finds were coming out of the ditch, it does seem to have been filled in at quite an early stage, and we've seen the sort of expansion into the backlots. And in these sort of rear areas as well, you're seeing the sort of things that again we've seen other excavations on Park Street. Here, we can't see them terribly well, but we're sort of a row of sort of shallow wood-lined troughs. We're assuming a part of the tanning process that's sort of expanding, run across the side and draining from one to the next. We're also seeing really good preservation of timber and organic material like this. So again, we're thinking possibly possibly a collapsed fence that's we have here. And again, also there's other timber work and troughs and routes. Again, something probably connected with water management for tanning and other things, other processes. The report on that should be forthcoming. Then moving on to the next site. This is Harper's Hill. Now this is in the jewellery quarter. And again, we're sort of leaping forward a fair way here into the 18th century. And when this, of course, would have been very much a rural area. So what's interesting about this site is would have been the home in Birmingham of James Watt when he first moved here to work with Matthew Bolton at Soho. And it's illustrated here on the back of a £50 note for the benefit of archaeologists like myself that probably have never seen a £50 note before. So here he is on the right. So Harper's Hill, again, 1779. You can just see St Paul's Church would have been a chapel there, and St Paul's Square. Within the first building, the roads gradually being sort of laid out for what would later become the jewellery quarter. And in the sort of area circled in the sort of red box there, we see the Harper's Hill. This would have been a sort of genteel sort of villa located on a hill with rather fine views looking out towards the city and towards where now the back of the library is, I suppose. And again, as we go to the 19th century, I mean, by the time we get here to the 1840s, we can actually see that the road plan being expanded into the rural area. We're seeing the houses. Again, it's quite a genteel suburb, but again, this genteel suburb didn't really last terribly long because it was quickly followed by the industry spreading out of the town. And again, it's something we see repeatedly across Birmingham. Industrialists, manufacturers moving to a residence on the edge of the town in the suburbs, and usually within about 20, 30 years, these buildings being converted to industrial use. And again, this is something you still see quite a lot in the jewellery quarter, and those early houses surviving but converted into factories. So this Harper's Hill, it did survive long enough to be photographed in 1879. This is just prior to its demolition. And this was taken by the Birmingham Archaeological Society, went out and photographed it. It was obviously worthy of note as early as 1879 as being a historic structure. And a large central house, semi-detached house with these sort of side wings on either side. The side wings probably would have contained kitchens and things like that, looking from the sides of the chimneys. So so James Watt, when he moved down from Scotland to work with Bolton, sort of arrived here. He wasn't a wealthy man at this stage. He was very much sort of a rented house. So again, this has come up for development recently, and an excavation by Archaeology Warwickshire. And after an initial strip off, there seemed to have foundations of the actual house. And again, once foundations after cleaning, but unfortunately after heavy rain, you get a fair good idea of the actual layout of the central building, with the right-hand house being slightly larger than what would be in the left-hand. The two pavilions at the side, unfortunately, were higher and were lost. So what we're really looking at here is the basement areas. But again, you know, we're still finding floors, finding artifacts, a lot of demolition deposits, plasterwork and things that basically give us a bit of an idea of what the internal furnishings would have been like. And George Demidovich has done a lot of documentary research on Bolton and Watts, and I think by the time once the documentary sources and the archaeology are strung together, we're going to have quite a strong picture of life in this area. And again, sorry, looking here in the cellars, so it would have been whitewashed cellars where the wine cellar would have been. And although we did find sort of things like sort of glasses and domestic items, unfortunately after we moved out, there were probably about another 20 other tenants, so we can't necessarily be sure that we have got his James Watt's wine glasses. Again, moving forward, not just further out of town, this is the Park Glass House on Dudley Road. So again, this is where you see opposite Dudley Road, where Dudley Road Hospital now is, and this has been redeveloped for housing, and would have sat on the edge of the original sort of Brindley contour canal. And again, seeing this pattern that we're seeing a lot in Birmingham of there was a rather desirable house, and that Mr. Hawker, who was previously living in town, moved out to, and we're assuming he must have bought the house and then moved his works next to his house, taking advantage of obviously the road connection, obviously the connection to the canal, and you've got the little wharf to the north. So, and a small drawing was produced of this. So we see the house there on the right, and the glass house on the left. And the glass house was usually Cones was obviously the most better well known place of glass manufacture. This glass house was more of a sort of a more a developed form. But we'll come back to this a bit later. So Isaac Hawker established the glassworks there in 1788, and it survives as a glassworks still about the 1870s, when it was replaced by Barker and Allen's German silver works. And most of the glasshouse buildings seem to have disappeared by 1870. And it's an excavation by Wessex Archaeology. And what we're looking at here is the wall of the cone, which you just sort of see at the frontage here, with the sort of furnace area towards the centre. And again, it was a bit of a surprise to find the cone, because the cone doesn't really seem to be mapped. And as we said, the pictorial images always sort of show it as sort of a rectangular glass house. I mean, heavily chopped around by the German silver works that was built over the top of it. German silver was sort of like an electroplating process. But again, here looking inside the cone, so they're working down on where the sort of sieges are there, where the furnace would have been in the centre. Again, you have the perimeter wall at the back up there. And then just there where the purple bottle is, you've got the remaining areas of what would have been the floor where the workers would have been carried out. And around the edge, we have these other sort of little, what we think of sort of annealing ovens and other ovens for reheating. So to give those who don't understand, don't appreciate furnaces, this is basically the way it would have worked. You would have a furnace in the centre with airways under and below it. And remain actually working within the cone, glass being pulled out of a central crucible, and then sort of handed over to workmen seated around that would then carry on the work. So this is again looking at the furnace here and the sieges. Again, this would have usually been a solid lump of masonry, which then would have had a drain pipe sort of cut through it, which is quite interesting because it did actually give us a cross section through what was actually inside it. And again, to the sides we also have the indications there of where you would have had flues of hot air coming in for the furnace. And again, this is a cross section of the sort of siege. This thing here that the white, this sort of vertical yellow line, which the white arrow is pointing at, we think is possibly the remains of a crucible that was just sort of flung into sort of make up the core of the furnace, and quite an unusual thing to survive. And then on the right here, we have this sort of crisscross of brickwork, which is the remains of sort of a regenerative process where be sort of hot gases leaving the furnace would have been used to heat cold gases coming into the furnace. And what's interesting about this is this process wasn't patented until about 1860. So what we're sort of looking at really is we found no evidence of the actual glass house. We did find the cone, and it almost seems like the cone, which is generally regarded as later technology, either replaced the glass house and it sort of went back to an earlier technology, or the glass house may never existed in the first place. And that's sort of finished area of the excavation there with the cone wall on the left. Then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about Curzon Street HS2. Now, Mary's going to be talking to you later about more of it, quite a lot of it. So, Parkside burial ground and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to quickly mention the work that was done on the railway station. Again, this was done by Mola Headland, a museum of London archaeology, and Headland from Herefordshire. And this is, until lately, would have been the post office depot in between the railway line and the think tank in Birmingham. Obviously, we've got the Philip Hardwick's main station building that survives today. This would have been the terminus of the London and Birmingham Railway coming up from Euston. And then actually along Curzon Street, I was going to say the Curzon Street station does actually face New Canal Street confusingly, but actually on Curzon Street would have been where the Grand Junction Railway terminus would have been. And this largely has disappeared, although the plinth of it does still survive if you look closely along the boundary wall. And this would have been a rather sort of elegant classical sort of screen wall, which you would have sort of passed through on the arches in your carriage, and then behind that would have been the actual sort of station buildings. So what we really have are two competing railways sitting side by side on the same site before it was all unified. And this is sort of a plan of the layout of how Curzon Street would have been, and you would have had London Birmingham Station, this area here. This is the roundhouse there, and the surviving building would be there. And then the Grand Junction Railway initially had their terminus of Vauxhall, which is pretty much where Dudley Station was. And they eventually expanded into join up next to the London and Birmingham, but all was left for them was this rather sort of cramped triangular site. So work was done excavating the Grand Junction Railway terminus, gives a bit more idea of its layout and how that worked. And you can see this sort of in this sort of side area here, looks a bit of a mess, but then we have the main sort of Curzon Street station in the distance. But again, you know, we're finding the layouts of the buildings. You're finding structures, cellars, mains of offices, artifacts below there. You're also finding remains of things like these small turntables here that were sort of used to sort of move vehicles sort of at sort of 90 degrees across parallel tracks, and quite a feature of sort of early railways, although it sort of disappeared as an operative thing on most main lines. You know, by the end of the 19th century, they did still survive in some sort of rural areas for sort of goods wagons. But I think what we're seeing really here is that railways developed technology developed very, very quickly. So from the opening of the railways in 1837, 1838, by the time we get to the 1850s, 1860s, a lot of the things that were 20 years old are obsolete. And this is what you learn from excavation of structures like this, of just picking apart. You know, a lot of it is documented, but just picking apart how this this technology moved on so quickly. And probably the main feature, of course, was the roundhouse here for stabling railway locomotives, built by designed by Robert Stephenson in 1837. And extended again and partly rebuilt in 1842. And gave a circular structure with sort of an entrance, sort of cone-shaped entrance to one side, which would have had a water tower, which the engines would have come in and out into a central turntable, and then sort of pits around the exterior. And again, this was an extremely sort of advanced piece of building and design for its time. And again, sort of looking a bit closer at this, it would have been the first railway roundhouse in the world, we think. So it would have predated those at Derby and those at Camden. So a real sort of pioneering structure that was then sort of erected across the world. And the drawing on the left is actually an enlargement of the drawing on the right. But again, giving an idea of the scale of this thing. This is the sort of cone-shaped entrance building, and you would have had a steam engine based in the basement that would have pumped water into the tank above. And as you can see, the actual railway tracks would have been sort of if you're looking at this, the actual level of the track would have been about here. So engines would have come in, they would have received water, they would have been cold. And this was then exposed. This only lasted till 1860, so it had a very, very short life. And the main reason for that was that trains got longer, trains got heavier, they needed larger locomotives, and the locomotives they were then building and using were too big to use the turntable and the actual sidings that actually sort of came off the turntable. So by 1860, this was demolished. It was demolished deliberately and very thoroughly, and the building materials then sold off. And but until the HS2 excavations re-exposed it last year. And so what we're looking at really, very much the sort of foundations of it. These are the bases of the inspection pits and the bases of the turntable. But again, I suppose really just to round up really and come to an end, that considering the number of development that's happened on that site since the 1860s, again, it's quite remarkable, really quite how much did survive. And I think just going back to the start, that's showing what, interesting range of archaeology survives in Birmingham, and often quite unpromising locations. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. A wonderful range of sites coming out of what you've shown us in Birmingham. Sites one probably never thought we'd get a proper chance to have a look at, and I'm personally very grateful for having been shown what a £50 note looks like. Like you, it's not
I'd seen one.
not something I'm particularly familiar with. We are about 10 minutes ahead of schedule. I don't really want to lose the time unnecessarily. So if I may, I will
John,
just...
I was just going to say, I've put up, I don't know if Chris wants, as we've got a bit of time, I've just put up a 3D model on the screen of the roundhouse. And I don't know if Chris just wanted to make any comment on that.
Chris?
Yes. I mean, this again, this shows it really well. And again, so the locos would have come in from the left-hand side there. They would have gone underneath this arched entrance, where you would have had this huge lead water tank there. The water tank would have been fed from below. Then officers either side, one for the crews, one for the superintendent, and then the sort of conical bit to the rear there. Sort of feeds in. You would have had coaling stages or coking stages. The coke would have been brought in, we think, from the canal, which would have been located to the side. So the canal, the coke would have would have come off a barge, placed into trucks, then wheeled in a tunnel that then would have emerged into a coke store that would then, it would have been subterranean, and then that would have been sort of wheeled along into that coaling, towards that coaling stage. So again, it was a really elaborate piece of construction, a real sort of cutting edge industrial structure from that real sort of pioneering days of railways.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks, Sam, for bringing that up. As I say, that's shaved a few minutes off. Let me just, Chris, a question has popped up, which I can direct to you because it's, I think, a factual one. The report on the Harper's Hill House excavation, do you know, is that going to be published as, is that actually going to be published? In other words, will it remain as grey literature, or will it actually be published, as it were, publicly?
The excavation only happened in December, so it's fairly sort of hot off the press. So I think the report's currently in preparation. It'll be available as grey literature online at some point. I think, as some of you may know, there's a book about Soho manufactory coming out fairly soon, published by Historic England. I think it's coming out this year. So whether there may be a scope for sort of a follow-up article combining the sort of documentary research and the archaeology, I'd probably watch that space, and maybe something for future volume transactions.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris.